Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew. Matthew, thank you for coming on the show and sparing some of your time today. I know we're in the run-up to Christmas and you're trying to shoehorn, as you say, a month's work into 3 weeks before the holiday season. So people will be listening to this in the new year. But thank you for making time before the Christmas break.
It's our pleasure, Simon. I really, this is a topic that is very near and dear to me. It's one of the programs that we run that I've worked in the program directly, and I have a lot of affinity for it, and so really happy to be here and have a chat.
Brilliant. We're going to have people with big hearts on this show, and I can tell right from the off that that includes you.
Well,
so could you introduce? Thank you. Could you introduce yourself to the listeners, please?
You bet. Yeah. So I'm Matthew McCall. I'm the Vice President of Community Services for an organization in the New England area of the United States called the Home for Little Wanderers, which is a very, very old organization, and that's why it has a very quaint name. And one of the programs that I oversee is our adoption program. And many years ago, I worked in our adoption.
This is apropos of nothing, right? But have you heard of a soccer club called Bolton Wanderers?
Yes, actually, I have.
You have? Okay.
So one of our former vice presidents was from England, and he got us all very much into proper football. So we learned a lot during that time.
So that's the only. I mean, that's the only. That's the only place I've heard, Wanderers used in the name of an organization. So it comes from, just a brief history thing. It comes from the Civil War era in the United States. In the aftermath of the Civil War, there were orphan trains that were run from southern cities that were largely completely destroyed, bringing children that were orphaned during the war up to northern states for care. And in reality, what happened was most of these children arrived in those northern states, the train stopped, and no one was there to take care of them. And they, in Massachusetts, started to be referred to by Boston's newspapers as Boston's Little Wanderers. And so a group of philanthropists got together and founded an orphanage to create a home for little wanderers, which is where that name comes from. And it's been around ever since. So, and if you live in Boston, you've heard of the home because we're sort of like one of those institutions that just kind of everybody knows because everybody's grandparents, brought toys for kids at the organization and stuff like that. Yeah. And you were saying it was founded in 1799, which I nearly fell off my chair because you think of you guys as a very young country,
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's pretty close to the founding of our country. We are the oldest in the country, actually. So we've been around for quite a while, and a lot of organizations merged and came together to make what we are today. But yeah,
fantastic. So when you hear this word, thriving adoptees, what comes to your mind, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the thing that I've seen a lot over the last 20 plus years of doing this kind of work is really like a transition from adoption being this mechanical thing that you go through, a series of paperwork that is completed, a process that oftentimes had a lot to do with lawyers and judges and not as much to do with human beings, to a process that more and more incorporates the humanity of everyone involved. And beyond, I think there's always been a lot of emphasis placed on the adoptive child. And then more and more emphasis being placed on the adoptive parent. And then more recently, more and more emphasis being placed on the birth family and thinking about how to build that out. And then in very recent years for us, we've started to focus even more on all of the things that need to happen to create a sense of permanency for everyone. How do we create a sense of permanency, a sense of belonging for the child that's being adopted, certainly, but how do we also create that for the adoptive family? How do we create that for the biological family? How do we create that for our communities in a way that builds stability? And the more of that there is, the more that everyone thrives. I was listening, and I don't know when you had this person on, but there was a woman that was on who started an adoption agency in New York. She has 10 children. She's lovely. And like you heard that in her description of her family, the moving from a closed adoption to an open adoption, and how the more that those relationships became stable, the more everyone thrived, right? And I think that's the adoption work that I have done, where the most disruption has happened, where adoptions have not thrived in the least, have often been when there are those attempts to create boundaries and create barriers in relationship that doesn't lead to that stability. Many, many years ago, I was involved with a post-adoption service with a family where, long story short of it was, there was a very intentional desire to basically pretend as if the child was never adopted in the first place, and the adoptive family was their only child, was their only family, the harm and damage that did to the relationship between the adoptive parents, because they didn't entirely agree on that idea, the harm and damage it did to the adopted child when they eventually discovered that and had realized that they had been lied to for all of these years. There was so much breakage there in the relationship. And then in the repairing of it and the opening up of the relationship, so much more stability, and all of those fears and anxieties that everyone had led to better strength in the end, and less of those fears. And I think those are the things as we look to the future of adoption that we more and more understand, as more and more adoptions became open, as the definition of an open adoption went from like, we'll send you a letter when they turn 18 to like, we will make you part of the family. The healthier and healthier things have become. And obviously that doesn't work in every situation, but the more you can do those things, I think the more that you see healthy adoptive, entire families, not just the family that did the adopting, but all of the members involved with it.
Yeah. So the episode that you're talking about, I think, is an interview with Michelle Freed.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you. That's been launched fairly recently. So if people want to listen to that, it's in the back catalogue, obviously on the podcast. And she also she talks about. So her son has also been on the show.
Mm-hmm.
So her son is gone into the family adoption agency, Zach Freed, and so it's interesting. That's the first kind of son-in-law I think we've had, so that's great. There's a couple of there's three themes there. I think for me that are all very intertwined. So two of them are yours, and one pops into my head on after hearing what another thing that you said. So permanency, stability were two of your big themes there, and trust as well. So when nobody likes, this is the whole thing about surprises, nasty surprises.
Yes.
Like when we feel that we've been lied to, it's got to be, whether we're talking about adoption, whether we're talking about, something our partner shares with us that we haven't heard before, the whole secrecy and obviously this massive transition that there's been from secrecy to openness, and that openness has got to be clearly one of the biggest building blocks of trust.
Yeah.
What have you seen as the most powerful drivers of permanency, stability, and trust on the back of the 20 years that you've seen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think I think that listening to and learning from the experiences of all of the people that have been involved with it, and hearing how much the stories coalesce with one another, and hearing the damage that gets done in those moments, and being able to then talk with families about, look at, like, you can try to keep a secret in a family, but they don't exist really. And no matter what you do with it, people eventually start to learn things. And I think especially in today's day and age, with the advent of things like, ancestry.com and all of those kind of DNA things, like, it's so much easier for people to discover these things. And, it's an interesting time of year. Like, I often will have friends reflect on, this time of year, like, when they told their child that Santa's not real, and that pain, right? And, like, people get that like feeling of, like, and that's a drop in the bucket of what it is to have had such a central core part of yourself hidden for so long from you or whatever. And I think, very often the more that we listen to our adoptive families, the more that we listen to our birth families, the more that we learn about just how much harm and damage gets done in trying to keep those secrets, and how it leads to a lack of a sense of permanency, because you're always afraid of the thing that's going to happen, instead of having it out there. And yeah, it gets messy and it gets tricky, because that's what being a family is. No matter what your journey to being a family is, it's messy and it's tricky. But it creates so much more stability and so much less harm in the long run. And I think, for the families, for the kids that I've worked with, where adoption has been an open thing from the day that they were born, and everyone has known about it, and it's been celebrated as the way in which their family came together, for that child, there isn't that moment of harm that's done when they discover what their journey was. For that birth mother who's open with the people in their lives that they're comfortable being open with about their adoption journey, there isn't that harm that comes when it's revealed for the first time and put out there in the world and people react to it. And that's where I think for us, the greatest learning has come in talking with adoptive parents who, have said, like, I spent 20 years worrying about this coming out, rather than being in the relationship with my child, with my family, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and I think it's also, we are human beings are relationship oriented creatures, and so the more that we are in relationship with people, the more stable that relationship is, the more successful everybody is, right? And especially when we start talking about some of the challenges that come with certain adoptions, trust and permanency and things like that are such a huge part of it. And if you don't engage with these pieces throughout the relationship, it can cause really, at times very, very difficult. I wouldn't say irreparable, but really, really difficult relationship mending. That can be really hard for folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word, you mentioned the word worry, and you also mentioned the word afraid.
Yeah.
One of the themes that's coming to me more and more clearly on pretty much every episode of the podcast that we record is that it's about what's going on for us. So what I mean, it's about what's going on for us. And when I say us, I'm talking about adoptive parents. Mm-hmm. And I'm with the listener on this. It's about what's going on for us. It's about where we're coming from. It's about how we're being in our relationship with our kids. Yeah. It's about us. It's about our emotional intelligence.
Yep.
And it's far more about that than it is about understanding of trauma, for example, yes. Yep. Or parenting techniques or anything. It's about.
I mean, those things are all important, right? but the foundation of all of that, one of my favorite, there's a guy named Charlie Applestein who writes books about working with kids that have grown up in really traumatic situations. He wrote a great book called No Such Thing as the Bad Kid. That's sort of like a how-to manual for people working with children who've had trauma. Wrote a really interesting series of books around what it is to be a kid living in group homes and residentials. But anyway, one of his frameworks is sort of this idea of like, human beings are a house, and the sort of foundation of that house, the thing that makes everything else possible, is that like really important core work that we do on kind of understanding ourselves and who we are and why we're motivated to do the things we are, and that creating a foundation that then you build everything else above. And if I don't really understand why I have these fears or where they come from or what's driving them, I can throw all the education in the world at you, but the second that your kid says something that triggers those same fears, you're not going to remember the thing that you read about like how to do, crisis intervention at a time when someone's really escalated. You're just responding in fear. Your amygdala kicks in, you have your fight or flight response. And away it goes. And so, yeah, that, to me, like one of my favorite parts of doing adoption work was like, everybody always liked doing the child assessments, and those are fun. Don't get, like it's great to meet kids and talk to them about what they're going through and think about like how to help them. And I'm a kid person. I love that part. I really liked doing the family development work. Working with a parent or parents, working with a family to understand where are you, where do you want to get to, what are the barriers between there, and a lot of that is that self-reflection. How were you raised as a kid? What are the things you're bringing forward? What are the misconceptions you have about adoption? Why do you think things are the way that they are? Doing that work to me is really oftentimes the thing that makes a huge difference. I've had adoptions go through. One of my first ones actually was a 15-year-old kid who, clearly knew he was being adopted, who essentially, was interested in a pre-adoptive placement, went to the family's home, and basically from day one was like, yeah, I don't want to get adopted. I just want to live out until I'm 18 and then be out of here. And the lucky thing for this kiddo, for me, because it made my life a little bit, was like the family was just like, okay, if that's what you want, that's what we'll do. And it was incredibly hard for them because they were very heartfelt about wanting to adopt this young man. It was what they wanted. They wanted to have that sense of permanency in their relationship. And they had done a lot of work about what they wanted to be as parents. And a big piece of what they wanted to be sure came through was, whatever you need from us, we're going to do for you. And this relationship is not about us, it's about you. And so they were able to be, to meet this young man where he was at. And I think what was beautiful about it was, instead of getting into a fight about, I don't want to get adopted, we want you to be our child, like this thing, because they took that away, it let him just explore the relationship in a non-confronting way. And within 3 or 4 months, he was like, yeah, I want to be adopted. But he just didn't trust them yet. He just didn't trust his relationship. And I'd seen lots of adoptions fall through, lots of risky adoptions fall through when parents didn't have a sense of who they were and what they wanted in the relationship, and or made it too much about their own needs and not enough about the kids.
So there's a lovely dichotomy there in the fact that it's all about us, adoptive parents,
and it's not.
Yeah, it's all about them too.
Yep. Well, I mean, that's, I think, just good parenting, right? Is, to be a good parent, you have to have dealt with your own stuff, right? And social services, like, we are riddled with people who come into this work because their own childhood was not quite right? And they're trying to help other people. And it's like, yeah, so you can do that, but until you get your own stuff square, you are only ever going to be responding to your own stuff in reaction to the kids that you're working with or your own children. And I think that's one of the things, that in order for it to be about somebody else, you have to be comfortable with your own self to the extent that any human being can be, right? I mean, no one's perfect. But yeah, absolutely. You have to create that sense of, stability within your own mind and relationships and things like that in order to do it well. And having children is a naturally destabilizing thing, and brings in, plenty of things that people sometimes don't even know that they're going to have a reaction to, that then comes up. And I think, adoption adds a layer of complexity to that, and a layer of complication. I did post-adoption work many, many years ago with a family that had adopted their child at 3 or 4 months, an international adoption. Child had no living memory of their family, and of their birth family. And the main crux of what brought them in for help, for support, was this underlying feeling that this young man had of, it's like, I know, like in my head, I know that you are never going to leave me, that you have always been here for me, that you are my family. And there is this part of my heart that is afraid that I will lose you, that is afraid that you'll go away someday. And many children I've worked with have that fear, right? Many children that were never adopted have that fear that their parents will go away, that something will happen to them. That's a natural fear, but the layer of complexity that the fact that this young man was adopted brought in caused that schism in trust, caused that, like, oh, is this because he's adopted? Is this because he's, all of that stuff that created a bigger thing out of it for the family than it would have been otherwise. And that was most of the work we did, was just, why are we reacting to this as strongly as we are? This is a normal, 11, 12-year-old kid's reaction. They question, or, it's the first time they understand mortality. It's the first time they understand concepts that, like, people can go away. Yeah, maybe certainly there was a part of it that was because he was an adopted child, but the bigger part of it was because he was a kid, and it was more the family reacting to it. This is because he's adopted, and making it more about the adoption than what it actually was. And that was mostly their own stuff, was dealing with their own fears as adoptive parents and what that was really about. So, yeah.
That's interesting one. It brought something up for me, and then I've forgotten. It's come back again.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing is, I remember when my granddad died when I was about 7.
Yeah.
And I remember my first brush with mortality and being gutted about that. And that's just kid stuff, really.
Yeah.
I think we've been into. I've discussed this a couple of times on previous editions of the previous episodes of the podcast. Is the kind of is this adoption related or is it not adoption related question?
Yeah.
And it can become a rabbit hole.
Yes, exactly.
It can become a distraction.
Yep.
It can become the ultimate time waster.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for me, the biggest thing when I think about my own experience, my own life, is if it's adoption related, it has it's less solvable.
Mm-hmm.
It's less solvable, and therefore it's scarier, and therefore we're going to push it away, or we're going to be more worried that we're going to, sorry to put it in such straightforward language, but we're going to screw it up.
Yeah. Which again, I think is like every parent's fear always, right? Is like, oh my God, I'm going to screw up this kid. But you're layering levels of complexity. And, to me, I've always sort of thought of it as sort of like very similar to like the nature versus nurture debate, which like for so long became everything that psychology was about, right? Is this inherent genetic, whatever, or is this learned behavior from the environment? And the reality is that was always like this distracting idea that it was a duality, when in reality it is both, right? And so, whatever your journey to become a family is, and whatever your family looks like, all of those aspects are real and a part of what creates who you are as an individual and who you are as a family. And so to deny one over the other is you spend a lot of time, is this or is this that? It's both. It is most likely that it is all of that. And in acknowledging that, it lets you move beyond it to understand like, okay, so whatever it is, we there are solutions to that to work through it. And rather than being afraid, for me, it's far better to acknowledge, yeah, there is a part of this that probably is about the fact that adoption was part of how I joined this family. And there is a part of it that is about every single behavior that has happened since then. And those things are very real as well. In the same way that when I work with families who have become parents through birth, or have become parents through other processes, those same things are at play. It's just that that isn't a hot coal that you grab onto, that this is because of the birth of the child leading to this thing. It's that adoption becomes this really challenging, amorphic idea that if we go into, we're just going to get lost in the rabbit hole of.
Okay, I'd really like to explore this a little bit.
Yeah.
And I haven't got an answer. Okay, I'm just exploring it. Yeah. So I've got two ways of exploring this, and I'm going to go with the perhaps easier thing first, and then I'm going to go with something really radical. Okay, just to explore it, right?
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. Have you heard of a book called Power versus Force by a guy called David Hawkins?
Nope.
Okay. So I do name check this book on the podcast sometimes, perhaps I think less than I used to. This guy created through experiments a scale of human consciousness, and 0 is and for consciousness we can use mood to a certain extent as a synonym for consciousness. Consciousness is a scary word, and so. But it's only kind of an effective word. It's not, because
there's more to the totality of that.
Yeah, it's more than that. So shame, for example, is 20. And 0 is dead. Pride is like 180. Unconditional love is 350, I think. And then we go to the great religious at the 1,000. It goes from 0 to 1,000. So at the 1,000 are all the great religious leaders. They calibrate at Jesus, Buddha. They calibrate at 1,000. So above 200 is life affirming, and below 200 is life detracting. So somebody that comes from like maybe a gang, it's somebody that's born into into a gang culture, some in some really tough part of town, and where there is a lot of drugs, there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of anger, you know. So that person maybe go into the military as a way of an escape from it. And because the United States Marine Corps calibrates at 180, right? So there's been a massive transition in this person's life from, you know, am I going to survive? To pride. So a huge shift. So this guy David Hawkins' contention really is that we are all operating, you know, within an up and down scale of that level of consciousness, and that is really so fear. So if fear is 50, say, and shame is 20, we might shift between those. And that kind of, that's what's going on. And he called it, the subtitle for the book is The Hidden Determinants of Human Behavior. But the idea is that our level of consciousness, and we all know that our mood goes up and down. This guy's just calibrated it. So for me, that's kind of, when I read that, I thought, that really makes a lot of sense, because this is where we're at. Our mood is, our level of consciousness is going up and down. And then so you're kind of nodding along with that. You can kind of
I follow that. Yeah. And I think, you know, when we see where we struggle in the world, it is often when we're, you know, from that sort of way of looking at things, it's as you slide down that scale towards your, you know, your 20s, you know, whatever the population is that you're working with people who've survived substance abuse treatment, you're working with people who've survived childhood trauma, you know, like, it is things like guilt and shame and fear that overtake that person's ability to utilize those higher level thinking things that they have. To even recognize that some of those other things are present. And so, yeah, in that respect, that makes perfect sense.
This guy actually, he's no longer with us, unfortunately, but he contends that just reading about the different levels that are available actually increases the level that, you know, the average level that people are operating. And then so that's something. So the radical approach. So the radical approach is a question that I have been mulling over and asking a few people. So I'm going to ask you rather than
sure.
So I'm 54, right? I'm coming up my 55th birthday in early January, and my mum and dad collected me from the adoption council in Liverpool, not too far away from Bolton Wanderers, about maybe 30 miles ago in February 1967, right? So the event happened then. My consciousness has gone up and down over those 54 coming up 55 years, right? So at some points I have been really low and felt that I'm not good enough, and that's shame, you know. Shame and not good enough are kind of bad stuff. And then sometimes I've just felt on top of the world. You know, I'm on top of the world having this conversation with you right now, and I pretty much always am when I'm having these episodes. People say, "You're so positive. I love your positive approach." Well, that's because I'm feeling good and I'm having a conversation. If you saw me, this morning, right? So there's a diversion in place. There's some roadworks going on, and I was like, you know, and I knew it was going one way, and then so I went a different way, and I got blocked there. And you wouldn't. It's a family show, right? So I'm not going to. I'm not going to say
what some expletives. Yes,
some expletives, right? So my mood goes up and down, right? So how can an event, you know, a fixed event that happened 54 years ago determine a variable experience. The two things don't really match up for me, and that's what I'm kind of exploring at the moment. I'd love to explore that with you.
So there's a pretty good book with a great title about childhood trauma called Ghosts from the Nursery. And it strikes me as you describe that as, sort of one of the premises of the book is this idea of like these experiences that ripple out over time. And I think a lot of the work that we end up doing with, families that come to us with challenges that have come up in their adoption journey, whether they're the birth family and now 30 years later, they're having strong reactions to their experience, whether it's the child or the adoptive family that is, struggling with aspects of it, is that idea of like guilt and shame about why they're struggling with it. And this feeling of, this was 55 years ago, 35 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, why is this still bothering me? And in reality, it is those ghosts from throughout our lives that continue to follow us, right? Whatever your journey was, whatever your relationship to other people is, those follow you. And I think it's, again, like it's true. It's a truth of us as human beings that's how we operate. So psychologically, right? A lot of people like create these really like this idea anyway, that a lot of like the psychological tests and things that we do are these really super sophisticated things. In reality, the best ones are super simple. It basically goes like this. Did you do something like this before? If you did, how recently did you do it? The more recent it was, the more likely you will be to do it tomorrow, right? And the challenge with that is that we just keep doing it again tomorrow, right? We have that feeling 50 years ago, and it happens again the next day and the next day and the next day and the next day. And it is human nature not to change our pattern of behavior. It is actually a ton of work for us to do something different. And so that for me is where a lot of that stuff comes from, is this idea that like I just carry this thing forward, right? Because like that's what we do as humans. We repeat our stuff over and over again until we break the pattern. And when you look at kind of whatever it is, whether you're talking about clinical treatment, whether you're talking about religious sort of orders and ways of going about things, whether you're talking about whatever it is about changing humanity, changing who you are as a human, it is largely about disrupting that process of just repeating the behavior over and over again for the rest of the time. And so, the how you get rid of that, the way that you like exorcise the ghosts from the nursery is very much in, more than anything, accepting that they're there. And that doesn't make you a bad son for not knowing that those things are a thing. It doesn't make your parents bad parents. It doesn't make you a bad parent. It is a thing that exists. And when we work through it, when we acknowledge it, it takes the power of it away and lets us work through it more effectively. Does that get at what you're getting at? Or did I miss the mark a little?
Not unless my follow-on from your metaphor is bob on, and I'll share what my follow-on is that basically the ghosts from the nursery aren't only show up now and then.
They only show up consciously now and then.
Well, okay.
You know what I mean? Like how much you're aware of them. Your awareness of those ghosts may drop back and come forward as, if we're using that same spectrum, right? When you're down in the 20s, those ghosts are going to be tangible things sitting next to you, Ghostbusters movie style ghosts. When you're at a 250, or a 230 or whatever, they are a tiny breeze in the background that you don't even notice, kind of a thing, because that level of consciousness allows them to move. That state of being allows you to move into, if we wanted to move away from that specific framework, brain-wise, our wise minds exist in like the part of the brain where I have no hair, right? Like, this prefrontal cortex is the thing that makes us human beings. The part of stuff that's like right behind your forehead. Those parts of the brain, when we're triggered, when we're scared, when we're upset, largely shut down, and we become much more fear-based reactionary creatures. And so, yeah, when something comes up that bubbles those ghosts up to the surface, they're going to be much more present and prevalent. And how much I even know what may trigger that may shift from moment to moment.
Brilliant. Yeah, I'm finding that, because I'd associated the ghosts as the driver, as the determinants of the mood, and you're flipping it round the other way and saying the mood determines the ghost, and
the two are inexorably connected. Right? It's that same, like, is it nature, nurture? Is it, like, you can't pull the two apart. They're connected to one another. And again, they're human nature, right? And so it's, how much do we attune to one versus attune to the other, right? And that is where I think, there are resources that are good for adoptive families to better understand, for adoptive kids to better understand, understanding what trauma is and how trauma affects you. And the very meat and potatoes of that, again, to David Hawking's idea of, like, the more that you understand this, the less it's going to affect you. Yes, that there's good stuff in there. A lot of the work that I do with kids that have been involved with trauma is doing just that. It's helping them understand, like, it's not that something's weird or wrong about you. You are doing exactly what humans do when they experience this thing, right? For our post-adoptive families, like, you are doing exactly what you do as a human. These worries, these fears, almost all other families have them, and it's okay, and don't fight them. And in doing that, then I can open myself to the education.
Now we're on to say, I'm glad you said that, because I was going to go somewhere with it, and you've with this, and in terms of our culture here, right? A mentor of mine, a guy called Michael Neal, talks about amotophobia. Now, I don't know whether that's his word or somebody else, but amotophobia is like the fear of emotions.
Yeah.
So I used to worry. Okay, now we all worry, but then I used to worry about worrying.
Yep.
So, I worry about worrying, and other people tell me that they're scared of being scared.
Yep.
Exactly. Other people that, they're anxious about being anxious.
Yeah.
So that adds, in a culture where, we've got to be positive.
Yes.
We've got to be positive. Always look on the bright side. Oh, Simon, I love your bright approach.
Right.
Yeah. When I'm in a high mood, my approach is bright. When I'm doing my Sweden about the doing my Sweden is a British thing. It means like getting upset.
Yeah.
Swede as in the vegetable, like a turnip, right? So doing my Sweden, like Swede is. I don't know why I'm explaining those, but like Sweden is slang for our heads. Doing my brain, doing my head in.
We do that. We call it a gourd, but same idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when I'm doing my Sweden about the road diversions going around our little village, so then obviously I'm not riding as high, but then so we it seems to be a cultural narrative is that you don't cry over spilt milk, get over it, all that sort of stuff.
The goal is to be happy.
The goal is to be
healthy, to be okay, no matter what.
And that leads to denying, squashing our bad feelings or whatsoever, and that just takes us further down. And we go further and further down the scale, or the trauma hole, or the worry hole, or whatever we call it, because we're trying to deny the emotions, I guess.
Well, and when you're talking about that difference between, being sad being a higher score than feeling shame, to me, that's what that brings up, right? Is I'm sad, but I also feel shame about the fact that I'm sad, right? I'm again, for many of the families that I've worked with, for their children, like I am coming to a certain, terms with the fact that I was an adopted child, and I'm needing to explore that right now. And yet I feel incredible shame about even bringing it up in the first place, right? Whether that comes from my family or it comes from somebody else, like that, the shame of that is what holds us back from it. And a lot of what we try to work with folks to understand is, again, to this, the themes that we started with, the more that you have a sense of permanency, the more that you have a sense of trust, the more that it is okay to open up about those things, because I know that I can go to my partner and say, I'm struggling right now with this part of how our family came to be. And I can trust that they're going to be okay with me bringing it up and talking about it, and not get angry and not get hurt, and or get angry and get hurt, but we're going to work through it. The more that my child can come to me and say, I'm thinking a lot about my birth mom right now, or I'm thinking a lot about my birth dad right now, and they trust and believe that our relationship is permanent, and I can trust that we are going to be okay and we're going to get through it. The more that those things exist, the more it's okay to have those feelings. And the more you stay up in that, 50, 60 range number, and not down in that shame, not down in that guilt that takes you away from working through the thing in the first place. And I think, very often we spend so much of our time in that space of worrying about worrying, instead of giving the space to allow for the worry to happen. And particularly when you start talking about adoption, particularly when you start talking about, this thing that is, family has been long-term, right? This sort of core experience that we all say is this really, that like sort of universally humans agree family is important. And when you start to question what family is, when you start to question what a relationship is, it digs at that core thing, that very central thing that is about being a human, is about being part of a group, being part of a them. And so it creates tons of shame and tons of guilt, versus, no, it's okay. We can talk about that. We can talk about whatever it is. And those are the healthiest. Those are honestly the families that I rarely get to interact with unless I know them personally. Friends of mine who have adopted children or blended families or things like that, it's the more healthy thing. I have a very, very good friend of my daughter's who has a mom and two dads. Dad number one was the dad that she was born to. Dad number two is the dad that her mom later married after the divorce. And like it was striking to me when I met them how much there isn't a thing about that in the family. She refers to them both as dad. Everybody knows which dad she's talking about. She has a wonderful relationship with her birth dad. She has a wonderful relationship with her stepdad. It's an incredibly healthy way to interact, and takes away what could be an incredible amount of shame and guilt and things like that for her when she's picking one over the other, choosing to acknowledge one over the other. And again, the same thing very often for adoptive families that I've worked with. That guilt and shame they feel distracts from ever getting to the thing that caused it in the first place. Yeah. And the reality is, once they address that, oftentimes those feelings go away.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, like for me, the work of adoption has become much more about how do we build that sense of belonging? How do we build that permanency within relationship? How do we know this isn't going to go away? in a way that is so much healthier for everyone and creates that. It's not like everything's perfect, right? Because no family ever is, except on TV. But it's that it allows for that sense of felt safety, and that's what then lets people work through these really difficult, challenging things.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time.
Sure.
But I do want to ask you, just take you back one thing that was when we talked about being afraid earlier on. And I just wanted to ask you briefly if you could share blind spots related to fear that adoptive parents don't see. Are there any common fears that that they have and that they don't see?
I mean, I think to me the most common ones that I see in the families that I've worked with are oftentimes the I'm not good enough. I'm not enough. That somehow as a parent, because I am an adoptive parent, that I'm not enough for my child. And this idea that if anyone else comes into that equation, it is an affront to me as a parent. Instead of the more people that come into loving and caring for my child, the better. And it's not a math equation where the kid only has 100 love points to spread out across, the people in their lives that they love. They have an infinite amount of it, and it's just more that they can get. And I think, and not just in relation to birth parents, I've certainly seen it in relation to that, but also just relationships in general, and this idea of a lack of trust in the relationship can sometimes lead to this fear of who is in that sphere and how do we make sure that enough people are. And then I think the other big fear that I see a lot is that I need to be perfect in some way. And I think it's one of the things that comes with like the difference in how you become a parent when you go through an adoptive process. And that can be really different from place to place. Like, some places it's more of a legal matter and whatever, but like a lot of places you go through training, you go through other things, and you get this idea that like I'm supposed to have the answers to these things, and then when you don't, because no parent does, I think that there's a lot of again, a lot of guilt and shame and fear that comes from that. That's really unfortunate. I think those are the big ones I see anyway.
Yeah. And how do parents see that? I mean, you talked about disruption. Earlier on, and it kind of the thing is, as soon as you said that, I thought, well, that's what we're trying to do with the podcast. We're trying to share insights to disrupt people's thinking.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it's that idea of like tapping into like radical acceptance of these things, and tapping into, so there's a clinical approach called dialectic behavioral therapy that for me has been one of the things that is the most sort of helpful in my own thought process as a parent and helpful in like work with families. And one of the core concepts is this idea that like you can hold two opposing ideas as equally true, even though they're in opposition to each other. So the idea of like, for instance, I am doing the very best I can as a parent and doing everything I can for my child, and I need to do more. And unfortunately, what a lot of times we do as parents is we choose an or, right? I'm doing everything I can as a parent, but I need to do more is not the same thing. It's learning to be able to accept both of those things at the same time as equally true, because then you don't feel the shame. You don't feel the guilt, because I am doing everything I can. And I need to do more as a parent. And so I'm going to actively seek those things out that still feel good about myself as a parent. And I think that's the trap that people fall into oftentimes, is they start feeling bad about themselves as a parent. And then you create self-fulfilling prophecy that is, I'm a bad parent. And so I stop being a good parent. But you stop being a good parent, not because you're a bad parent, but because you believed that you were. And as a result of that, you failed. And that to me is one of the more, transformative kind of things when you can help parents to start to see that.
I love that. I've never heard that before. I've heard that about that therapy, but I've never heard it summed up in such a clear way. So you've clearly got a gift on this.
There you go.
The one that came up for me is like I came up with my own one, right? Which I've kind of something from the past. A phrase that I've heard. I thought, I could just slot that into what Matthew's saying. Perfectly imperfect.
Yeah. Yep.
Or
and it's
imperfectly perfect. Or perfect.
And whichever. And being okay with both of those parts of me, right? Like this is who I am, and I would like to improve upon those aspects. It's a hard thing for us as humans to do. We're very problem oriented, and a lot of the stuff that I see in families that I work with, like that becomes the focus. The focus is the problem, and not focusing on all of the things that are going right. And what really helps is when you acknowledge both. Yes, there's a problem, and there's all this wonderful stuff.
I had a funny, really, I've had a couple of funny conversations for the podcast where people have started a conversation and they've just given me all the negatives, all the trauma stories, and I'm like, I know that I'm an adoptee. I'm in this space. I know you don't need to. You don't need to give me all that.
But it's like a resume almost. Like there's been plenty of clients that I've worked with that like will come in to meet with me. They sit down and like launch into a 20-minute, here are all the bad stuff that has happened to me and all the terrible things that have happened in my life. And I'll have the same kind of thing where I'm like, okay, so before we go into all of that, what's your favorite thing to do every day? What are the things that you enjoy? Like all of those kind of things. And it's almost like disruptive of like, the idea of therapy is to come talk about your problems. Oftentimes the best therapists don't talk a lot about your problems. They talk a lot about what's working well in your life, and then you expand upon those things. And it's not that you ignore the bad, you pay attention to it, but you don't ignore the good because you're paying attention to the bad. And there's a part of it that is about accepting who I am and my core being good enough, and not having that core belief of I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, like those things, working through that core belief to like, no, I'm good enough and I need to do better at these things. That can be so changing for people.
I had, it's beautiful. I had something on this. Heard something. Yeah, I was talking to a coach the other week, and I realized afterwards she'd taken me down the dark stuff.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, yeah. Now now I know why. So reading Nancy Verrier's Primal Wound book took me down until I realized that I don't actually agree with the theory.
Yep. Yeah.
One of my favorite questions is on this subject, because I know that it's a concern of parents. Parents are concerned about the primal wound, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't even know it was a thing.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't a thing till
someone told me.
Till somebody, and that took me down. So I'm going to ask you my favorite question on the primal wound. Okay.
Yeah.
What is it that's wounded, Matthew?
So to me, what's wounded, if you're going down that road, is it's the belief that the wound exists that creates the wound. It is the idea that what brought me to be who I am today, or what brought my child into my family, or what is somehow not good enough and not okay, that creates the wound itself. So I'll give you a really quick anecdote. Many, many years ago, I was working in a group home with children, and we had gone to go see a movie called Little Giants, which was a movie about American football. And there's a scene in the movie where one of the kids bangs his head really hard and is like acting really goofy and really weird. And one of the other kids in the movie turns to somebody and says, "Oh, I guess he forgot to take his medication this morning." And the kids that I'm with sort of burst out laughing for like a half a tick, and then stop laughing as they realize that they all take medication to help manage their mental health. And they're like in a movie theater where a movie is making fun of them. And I think for me, the thing that was the most unfortunate about that was this idea that if you have an imbalance of serotonin in your brain, you are somehow different than someone who has an imbalance of, oh my goodness, what is it? The diabetics don't produce insulin. Like nobody says to a diabetic, well, what's the matter with you that your body doesn't produce insulin? But for some reason, we have this idea that like a mental health issue, or a journey to become a parent that isn't about biologically producing your child in a sort of normal process, that those things aren't normal, that those things aren't real. And it's the wounds that we create, to me, that become, it's so unfortunate, because they're all part of who we are. They're all part of what we are. And it goes back to that idea that like everything is supposed to be perfect. Everything is supposed to be okay. And sure, in a perfect world, everything would be perfect, but we don't live in that world. We don't live in that reality. And so to me, it's the belief that that wound is somehow real, that makes it real, that gives it energy, that gives it life. And that's the unfortunate.
Wow. That's really blown me away on the fact that I had an idea a few months ago that's quite similar, and it is the belief that there are such things as limiting beliefs itself a limiting belief.
Yeah, exactly, right. And like, I've worked with plenty of families, I've known plenty of families that the fact that their child came to them through adoption was something that was always celebrated, always enjoyed, and it's not that doesn't bring up stuff, because society, even though their own family may say there's nothing to feel shame around here, there's nothing to feel bad about with this, they get the messages over and over again in society that there's something to feel shame about. And so certainly it'll come up for the child, but in a way that is so much less harming, because the belief that harm was done in the first place wasn't at least introduced in the family. And yeah, I mean, to me, there's huge healing that comes as you identify, like, okay, so this is a thing that I've created that I can uncreate. Yeah.
So I had a thought on this yesterday, because I think about this a lot. So healing starts with the glimpse that we may not be wounded.
Yes. Yeah.
And
if you look,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And finishes when we see ourselves as whole.
Yeah. So 13 years ago now. Yeah. I had a really nasty accident, broke 19 things altogether, including a really horrible femur fracture. And I remember being in the hospital and having this reaction of like, the leg got put back together surgically. I have a big titanium rod that holds my leg together. And the day after the surgery, they're like, all right, well, we're going to get you up and have you walk. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I can't walk. I just broke my leg, and like I had this huge surgery, and like, no, you're gonna walk, and it's gonna hurt, and it's gonna be okay, but you're gonna do it anyway. And I remember, like, in the moment, I didn't reflect much on it because it mostly just hurt, and I was, going through it. But years later, sort of reflecting on, like, and talking with a really good friend of mine that's a doctor, who said, I was reflecting on like how I didn't expect that to be my experience. I expected them to be like lay in the bed for 6 months and recover. And he was like, right, that's what we did until very recently. And then we discovered people who lay in the bed and recover take a lot longer to get better. And when we tell you you're okay and to walk and it's going to hurt, but it's all right, you get better faster. And you recover quicker and all of that. And like, that idea of like, because we tell you something is wrong here, that the goal is to like stop everything, and versus like, no, we have to keep moving through this, and it's okay that this hurts, and it's okay that it's wrong, and it's the moving through it that will make it better, versus pushing it away and trying to pretend everything's okay. Yeah.
So on that, I have definitely, it has hurt. Adoption has hurt.
Yeah.
Like wounds hurt.
Yes.
But it hasn't wounded me because because I'm not my feelings.
Yeah.
Right? My feelings have been hurt.
Yep.
My sense of identity has been hurt. What some people might call their ego, that has been hurt. But I'm not my feelings. I'm not my sense of identity or my ego. Who I truly am in my kind of like my experience and my worldview, my perspective, my paradigm, whatever, is that we are fundamentally and essentially unwoundable, because who we are isn't a thing that can be wounded.
Yeah. And it's that idea of like, is it pain or is it an injury? Pain is a thing you work through. An injury is something that you can't work through. And like this idea that like, there are injuries, right, that people go through when they have traumatic brain injuries or things along those lines. But the wounds, the pain, the hurt that is being a human being, the more that we engage with it and acknowledge it, the more energy you take out of that pain, right? Again, on that same story from my own experience of dealing with pain, I did my rehab at a place called Spalding, which is in Boston. And the rehab hospital sits over this river that runs right through the center of town. And it's a gorgeous view. And the tables they would put you on to do all the work on you had a view of like the Boston skyline and the Charles River. It's lovely, beautiful. And I remember laying there in just agony and like so focused on the pain and not wanting the pain to happen and wanting it to go away. And then I started thinking about like my clinical training and things I know and yada, yada, yada. And I was like, right, so this hurts. But it's not the only thing I have to experience right now. And if all I focus on is the pain and all I focus on is the hurt, and trying to avoid it, then I don't move beyond it. And so I was like, all right, well, just accept that this hurts. And the moment that I did, I looked up and looked at the skyline and was like, wow, that hurts like hell, but this is lovely. And there's so many other wonderful parts of being here that aren't about the pain. And so it wasn't like pretending like it didn't hurt that helped. Because then I put all my energy into avoiding hurt, which I couldn't avoid, as opposed to just like, okay, well, that hurts and this sucks and this is lovely and this physical therapist is lovely and et cetera, et cetera. I think for many parents and for many children, that attempt to move away from things that are painful because if I engage with them, it's going to cause an irreparable wound, is actually what causes the wound, instead of just acknowledging it and working through it and like accepting, like, there are painful parts of being a kid. There are painful parts of being a parent. And if we move through those and work through those, we actually will get better.
That's a brilliant place to end. Thank you. This has been it's been an incredible conversation, Matthew. And I hope you listeners have enjoyed it too. Been a little bit longer than the usual thing, but we were on a flow, and there's no way I was going anywhere. So thank you very much, Matthew. And please, listeners, do check out. There'll be links to Matthew and the home in the show notes. Check them out, and share this episode. You know, this is the wisdom that's been generated. Well, Matthew's been working in this field 20 years, but the shared wisdom of something that an organization that started in 1799 needs another look at.
Yeah, totally. It's been a true pleasure, my friend.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, listeners, and we will speak to you all again soon. Thank you.